Fort Lawton, Washington, April 1944. The spring rain hammered against the corrugated metal roofs of the barracks as Corporal James Mitchell of the 531st Port Battalion stood at attention, reading his orders for the third time. He and his unit, all African-American soldiers who had loaded more cargo ships in the past 6 months than most men would see in a lifetime, were being reassigned to a new duty, escorting German prisoners of conflict to recreational activities around the Seattle area. The irony wasn't lost on Mitchell as he folded the paper and looked at his men, all of them skilled longshoremen turned soldiers, all of them wondering the same thing he was. How had they gone from fighting for their country to serving men who had fought against it? What these soldiers couldn't have known, standing in that rain-soaked Washington fort, was that their next assignment would force them to confront a truth more painful than any they had faced on the docks or in training. That in their own country, in their own army's eyes, the enemy was treated with more dignity than they were. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how a routine prisoner escort mission became a turning point that would expose the deep contradictions of fighting for freedom abroad while being denied it at home, and how one group of soldiers found a way to resist that would echo through the decades that followed. The morning of April 22nd began like most others at Fort Lawton. Corporal Mitchell assembled his detail of 12 men outside the prisoner compound at 0600 hours. The German prisoners of conflict, approximately 40 of them, were already waiting, chatting among themselves in their native language, some smoking cigarettes that had been provided by the Red Cross. Mitchell noticed, as he had every time he performed this duty, that the prisoners looked well fed, their uniforms clean and pressed, their boots polished to a shine that would have made any drill sergeant proud. The prisoners had been captured at various points across the European theatre. Some had surrendered in North Africa, others in Sicily, still others during the push through France. They represented a cross-section of the German armed forces, former factory workers, school teachers, farmers, clerks. Most were young in their 20s or early 30s, though a few grey-haired veterans were scattered among them. They had been processed through interrogation centers, classified as low-risk prisoners, and eventually assigned to Fort Lawton, where they performed light labor and awaited the end of hostilities. Private First Class Robert Washington stood beside Mitchell, his jaw tight as he watched the scene. Washington had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, where he had learned early what it meant to stand in the back, to lower his eyes, to accept his place. He had joined the army hoping that things might be different in uniform. He had been 22 years old then. Now, at 24, he knew better. His father had worked in the steel mills, coming home every night covered in soot and sweat, earning a fraction of what white workers made for the same labor. His mother had cleaned houses for white families, entering through back doors, eating her lunch on the back porch no matter the weather. They had both told him that education and hard work would change things, that if he proved himself worthy, doors would open. The army had seemed like a chance to prove that worth, to serve his country and earn respect in return. The transport trucks arrived at 0615, right on schedule. Sergeant Harold McKinney, a veteran of the Port Battalion who had supervised the loading of over 200,000 tons of military equipment, barked orders to his men. They would be escorting the prisoners to downtown Seattle for what the official orders called approved recreational activities. What that meant, Mitchell had learned over the previous weeks, was taking enemy soldiers to places where he and his men were not allowed to go. McKinney was a man who commanded respect without demanding it. At 36 years old, he had lived through the Depression, working whatever jobs he could find to support his family. He had unloaded barges on the Mississippi, picked cotton in Louisiana, worked construction in New Orleans. He had seen the country from its lowest rungs, had experienced every variation of discrimination the South could devise. When the opportunity to enlist came, he had seized it. Not out of patriotic fervor, but out of practical necessity. The army paid better than civilian work available to colored men, and it offered a kind of structure and purpose that Depression-era America had denied him. The convoy rolled out of Fort Lawton at 0630. Mitchell rode in the lead truck with Washington and 4 other soldiers. Behind them came 3 trucks carrying the German prisoners, and bringing up the rear was another truck with the remaining American guards. The morning was overcast, typical for the Pacific Northwest spring, and as they drove through the gates of the fort, Mitchell found himself thinking about a letter he had received from his mother back in Georgia, just 2 days earlier. She had written about his younger brother, Thomas, who had been refused service at a diner in Atlanta, despite wearing his army uniform home on leave. The owner had pointed to a sign that read, "No coloreds," and told Thomas that uniform or no uniform, the rules were the rules. His mother's handwriting had been shaky when she described Thomas's face, the way he had stood there for a moment in his pressed uniform with his service ribbons, and then turned and walked out without saying a word. Mitchell had read that letter 3 times, each reading making him angrier than the last. Thomas was 19 years old, stationed at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, training with the 92nd Infantry Division. He would soon be shipped overseas to fight in Italy, to face enemy fire, to risk his life for a country that wouldn't serve him a cup of coffee. The convoy wound its way through the streets of Seattle, passing blocks of neat houses and blooming cherry trees. Citizens waved at the trucks, some likely assuming they were seeing American soldiers heading out on maneuvers. None of them could see inside the covered transport vehicles, couldn't see that the soldiers being waved at were prisoners of a defeated army, while their guards were Americans, whose only crime was the color of their skin. Seattle had a complex relationship with its African-American community. The city had grown rapidly during the conflict years, its shipyards and aircraft factories drawing workers from across the country. The African-American population had swelled from fewer than 4,000 in 1940 to over 15,000 by 1944. But growth had not brought equality. Housing discrimination confined most black residents to the Central District. Restaurants and theaters maintained segregation policies, sometimes explicitly, sometimes through unwritten but firmly enforced rules. The city liked to think of itself as more progressive than the South, but the difference was often merely cosmetic. At 07:20, the convoy pulled up outside the Liberty Theater on 2nd Avenue. Mitchell had been given explicit instructions: escort the prisoners inside, ensure they were settled in the designated section, and then wait outside until the showing was complete at 09:30. The theater was showing a Western film, something about cowboys and frontier justice, the kind of story where good triumphed over evil and everyone knew which was which. The Liberty Theater had opened in 1928, one of the grand movie palaces that had sprung up during the silent film era. Its facade featured Art Deco styling, with geometric patterns in brass and colored glass. Inside, the lobby was decorated with murals depicting scenes from American history: pioneers crossing the plains, gold miners staking claims, settlers building communities. It was a temple to American mythology, to the idea of the frontier as a place where anyone could succeed through hard work and determination. The irony of that mythology being celebrated in a building that excluded Americans based on their race was apparently lost on the theater's management. But as Mitchell stepped down from the truck and saw the marquee, saw the ornate entrance with its polished brass fixtures, he felt something shift inside him. This was one of Seattle's finest theaters, the kind of place where men wore suits and women wore their best dresses, the kind of place where, he knew without having to ask, he would not be allowed to buy a ticket, uniform or no uniform. The German prisoners filed out of their trucks in orderly fashion. They had been briefed on the rules: stay together, follow instructions, return to the trucks at the designated time. Many of them were smiling, excited at the prospect of a few hours away from the routine of camp life. For them, captivity in America had proven far more comfortable than service in the conflict had been. They received 3 meals a day, more food than many of them had seen in years. They slept in heated barracks with real mattresses. They had access to medical care, to recreation, to correspondence with family back home. Some of them would later admit that their time as prisoners of conflict in America had been among the best periods of their lives. One of them, a former schoolteacher named Friedrich Weber, nodded politely to Mitchell as he passed. Weber was 32 years old, a slight man with wire-rimmed glasses and thinning blonde hair. He had taught literature and history in a small town in Bavaria before being conscripted into military service in 1941. He had served as a clerk in a supply unit, never seeing combat, until his entire company had surrendered to American forces in France in August of 1943. Weber spoke some English, learned from books during his teaching years, and over the previous weeks he had occasionally exchanged small talk with his guards. He had mentioned once that he had never wanted to fight, that he had been conscripted, that he hoped the conflict would end soon so he could return to his classroom in Bavaria. He dreamed of teaching again, of helping students understand literature and history, of living a quiet life devoted to learning and thought. Mitchell had found it difficult to hate Weber, which bothered him more than he wanted to admit. How could he feel more anger toward the theater that wouldn't admit him than toward men who had worn the uniform of an enemy nation? But Weber seemed genuinely decent, genuinely regretful about the conflict, genuinely eager to return to a peaceful life. He had shown Mitchell photographs of his wife and young daughter, talked about the books he missed reading, discussed his plans for when he could go home. It was hard to see him as the enemy when he seemed so ordinary, so human, so much like the teachers Mitchell had known growing up. Private Washington stood at the theater entrance as the prisoners filed past. The theater manager, a thin man in his 50s named Arthur Shelby, stood just inside the door, checking off names on a clipboard. He barely glanced at the prisoners as they entered, treating their arrival as routine as the delivery of film reels or the restocking of concession supplies. Shelby had managed the Liberty for 12 years, taking pride in running what he considered a respectable establishment. He enforced dress codes, maintained order in the theater, and ensured that the Liberty remained a place where Seattle's better families felt comfortable bringing their children. That meant, among other things, maintaining certain standards about who was admitted. Then Washington stepped forward, intending to follow the prisoners inside to ensure they were properly seated. It was part of his orders, part of his duty as a guard. Shelby raised his hand, palm out. The gesture was casual, practiced, as natural to him as breathing. "You'll need to wait outside," Shelby said, not unkindly, not with any particular malice, just stating a fact, like commenting on the weather. Washington stopped. For a moment he didn't speak, didn't move. He could feel the eyes of his fellow soldiers on him, could sense the prisoners pausing to watch. The moment stretched out, heavy with implications that Shelby didn't even seem to recognize. Then Washington said, his voice carefully controlled, "I'm their guard. I need to ensure they're properly seated." Shelby shook his head with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone who should already understand. "They'll be fine. We have ushers inside. You can wait out here with the others." "I have orders," Washington began, reaching for the paper in his pocket that detailed his responsibilities. "And I have policies," Shelby interrupted, his tone firming slightly. "This is a whites-only establishment. The prisoners are permitted under special military authorization, but that authorization doesn't extend to—" He paused, choosing his words with the care of someone who had given this speech before. "To your personnel." The words hung in the air like smoke. Several of the German prisoners had paused just inside the entrance, watching the exchange. Weber was among them, his expression unreadable behind his glasses. Was that embarrassment on his face? Confusion? Or just the blank look of someone witnessing something that confirmed everything he had heard about America, but had hoped wasn't true? Mitchell had come up behind Washington. He had heard every word. He felt his hands curl into fists at his sides, felt his jaw clench, felt a wave of anger rise up from somewhere deep in his chest. Then he consciously unclenched his fists, relaxed his jaw, pushed the anger down into that place where he had learned to store such feelings. Getting angry wouldn't help. Getting angry would only make things worse, might even get them written up, court-martialed, sent to a disciplinary unit. The army didn't look kindly on soldiers who couldn't control themselves, especially soldiers who looked like him. "It's fine," Mitchell said quietly to Washington, putting a hand on his shoulder. "We'll wait outside." But Washington didn't move. He was staring at Shelby, then past him at the prisoners filing into the theater, finding seats in the plush auditorium, settling in to watch a film about American heroes conquering the frontier. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper, but every man near him heard it clearly. "They fought against us, against America, and they get to go inside, but we can't." It wasn't a question. It was an observation, a statement of fact so absurd that saying it aloud made it seem even more impossible, to even more cruel. How do you explain to someone that the enemy deserves better treatment than you do? What words could possibly make that make sense? Shelby had the decency to look uncomfortable, but his expression hardened. He had a business to run, standards to maintain, policies that existed whether he personally agreed with them or not. I don't make the rules, soldier. I just follow them. Now please step back from the entrance. Mitchell put his hand on Washington's shoulder and gently pulled him back. The other soldiers from their unit had gathered nearby, all of them having witnessed the exchange. None of them said anything. What was there to say? This wasn't new, this wasn't surprising, this was just the way things were, had always been, would apparently always be. You could wear the uniform, you could serve your country, you could risk your life and it wouldn't matter. Not where it counted. Not in the places where human dignity was supposed to be universal. The soldiers took up positions around the theater entrance. They would stand there for the next 2 hours and 10 minutes, waiting while men who had served in the army that had devastated Europe, that had committed atrocities across an entire continent, enjoyed an American film in comfort and safety. Private Eugene Carter, who had grown up in Chicago and had once believed that the North was somehow different, somehow better, leaned against the brick wall of the theater and lit a cigarette. His hands were shaking slightly, though whether from cold or anger, he couldn't have said. Carter was 23 years old, the son of a Pullman porter who had fought in the previous global conflict. His father had served in France with the 369th Infantry Regiment, the famous Harlem Hellfighters, had earned medals for bravery, had returned home expecting recognition and respect. Instead, he had returned to a country in the midst of the Red Summer of 1919, when racial tensions had exploded into violence in cities across America. His father had put his medals in a drawer and never wore them again, had taken a job as a porter and raised his children to keep their heads down and not make trouble. "My father told me," Carter said to no one in particular, his voice rough with barely suppressed emotion, that when he fought in the first conflict, he thought things would change when he got home. Thought that if colored men bled for America, America would remember. He came back to Chicago in 1919 and couldn't get a job anywhere except the stockyards. Couldn't rent an apartment outside the Black Belt. Couldn't vote without facing a literacy test that white men never had to take. He took a long drag on his cigarette, watching the smoke dissipate in the damp morning air. He told me I was a fool for enlisting. Told me nothing ever changes. Told me the uniform wouldn't protect me, wouldn't earn me respect, wouldn't make any difference at all. Sergeant McKinney, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. His voice was thoughtful, measured, carrying the weight of decades of experience and observation. McKinney was 36 years old, older than most of the men in the unit, and he had seen more of the world than most of them ever would. He had worked the docks in New Orleans, in Mobile, in Charleston. He had loaded ships that carried supplies to Europe, to Africa, to the Pacific. He knew the scope of the conflict, understood the stakes, comprehended the vast industrial and logistical machinery that was grinding the enemy forces into submission. "My grandfather was enslaved," McKinney said, his words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "Worked a plantation in Mississippi until he was 23 years old. When freedom came, he thought that was it, that he was finally going to be treated like a man. But they found other ways. Sharecropping, Jim Crow laws, lynching. They always find other ways." He paused, watching as the last of the prisoners disappeared into the theater, the ornate doors closing behind them. "But he also told me something else. He said that every time they try to push you down, you got to find a way to stand back up. Not by fighting the way they want you to fight. You'll lose that every time. But by making them see their own contradictions, by making them uncomfortable with what they're doing, by forcing them to confront the gap between what they say they believe and what they actually do." Mitchell listened to McKinney's words, turning them over in his mind. He thought about the official reports he would have to file after this duty. He thought about the officers who would read those reports, most of them white men who would see nothing unusual about the day's events, who would consider it just another routine prisoner escort successfully completed. He thought about the chaplain at Fort Lawton, a kind man who had once told him that patience and faith would eventually lead to justice, that change came slowly but surely. He thought about his mother's letters, always encouraging him to keep his head up, to remember his worth, to believe that better days were coming. And then he thought about something else, about the power of documentation, about the importance of records, about how history was written by those who controlled the narrative, and how sometimes, if you were clever enough, if you were patient enough, if you were precise enough, you could add your own voice to that narrative in ways that couldn't be ignored or erased or dismissed. The film began at 0800 hours. Through the theater walls, the soldiers could hear the muffled sounds of music, of dialogue, of audience reactions. The German prisoners were enjoying their American entertainment, probably grateful for a brief respite from the monotony of camp life, probably not thinking at all about the men standing outside in the spring rain that had started to fall again, coming down in a steady drizzle that soaked through their uniforms and chilled them to the bone. Private First Class Daniel Brooks, standing a few feet from Mitchell, pulled his collar up against the rain. Brooks was from Detroit, where he had worked in an auto factory before enlisting. He was 25 years old, married, with a 1-year-old daughter he had never met. Born 3 months after he shipped out for basic training, his wife sent him photographs, and he kept them in his pocket, looking at them whenever he had a spare moment, marveling at how much his daughter had grown in just 12 months. Brooks had a small Kodak camera that his wife had given him before deployment, a going-away present so he could send home pictures of his experiences. He had been using it to document his service, taking photographs of the ships they loaded, the cargo they moved, the daily routines of Port Battalion life. Now, standing in the rain outside the Liberty Theatre, Brooks pulled out his camera. He began taking photographs of the scene, the theatre entrance, the soldiers standing guard, the contrast between the ornate building and the men prohibited from entering it. He knew these photographs might be important someday, might serve as evidence of something that seemed so normal to everyone involved, but was actually profoundly wrong. At 09:45, the film ended. The prisoners emerged, still chatting among themselves, some laughing at jokes from the movie. They looked refreshed, entertained, grateful for the diversion. Weber paused as he passed Mitchell and Washington, his expression troubled. He seemed to want to say something, to acknowledge what had happened, to somehow apologize for being granted access that the American soldiers were denied. But what could he say? How do you apologize for a system that favors you through no merit of your own? "Thank you," he said finally in his accented English, "for accompanying us. It was a pleasant morning." Washington stared at him, his face expressionless. He didn't respond, didn't acknowledge the words. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, Weber moved on, joining his fellow prisoners in the trucks. The convoy returned to Fort Lawton by 10:30. Mitchell filed his official report, noting the time of departure, the route taken, the duration of the recreational activity, and the time of return. Everything standard, everything by the book. The report went into a filing system where it would be processed, reviewed, and eventually archived, just another piece of routine paperwork in the vast administrative machinery of the military. But that night, alone in his quarters, Mitchell took out a personal journal he had been keeping since his induction. He had been writing in it sporadically, recording not the official events of his service, but his personal observations, his thoughts, his feelings about what he was experiencing. The journal had become a kind of refuge, a place where he could be honest about what he was seeing and experiencing without fear of official sanction. And now he wrote about the events of that morning in detail, capturing not just what had happened, but what it had meant, what it had revealed about the country he was serving and the army he was part of. He wrote, "Today we escorted enemy prisoners to a theater where they were welcomed while we were turned away. The manager didn't even seem to think there was anything wrong with this. To him it was just policy, just the way things are. But if this is the way things are, then what are we fighting for? What does freedom mean if it only applies to some people? What does victory mean if it doesn't change anything at home? We are risking our lives, performing dangerous work, serving our country with honor and dedication. And yet we are treated as less than the men we defeated, less than the men who fought against everything America claims to stand for. How do we reconcile this? How do we continue to serve knowing this? And yet, what choice do we have?" Over the next 3 weeks, Mitchell and his unit performed the same duty 7 more times. Each time the routine was identical: transport the prisoners to approved recreational facilities, escort them to the entrance, and then wait outside, while the prisoners enjoyed amenities that the soldiers themselves were denied. They took prisoners to restaurants where Mitchell and his men couldn't eat, establishments that served German captives while maintaining no-coloreds policies. They took them to parks where separate facilities existed for colored visitors, where the prisoners were granted access to the main recreational areas, while the American soldiers were directed to inferior, segregated sections. They took them to sporting events, where the soldiers had to stand in segregated sections while the prisoners sat in the main stands watching baseball games and enjoying the atmosphere of American leisure. And with each repetition, something built up inside the men of the 531st Port Battalion. Not violence, they were too disciplined for that, too aware of the consequences. Violence would accomplish nothing except their own destruction, but a quiet, burning determination to make someone somewhere acknowledge the absurdity of what was happening. A conviction that this needed to be documented, recorded, made part of the official record where it couldn't be ignored or forgotten. Private Brooks continued taking photographs at each location, building a comprehensive visual record of the prisoner escort duties. He photographed the prisoners' boarding buses for recreational trips. He photographed the entrances to facilities where the prisoners were admitted and the soldiers were not. He photographed his fellow soldiers waiting outside in the rain, in the cold, maintaining their discipline and their dignity while being treated as less than the men they were guarding. One photograph in particular would later become significant. It showed Private Washington standing at attention outside the Liberty Theater, rain dripping from his helmet, his uniform soaked through, his face set in an expression of rigid control. Behind him, visible through the glass doors, German prisoners could be seen settling into comfortable seats, laughing and chatting, enjoying their American entertainment. The contrast was stark, undeniable, impossible to explain away or rationalize. Brooks sent copies of his photographs to the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the leading African-American newspapers in the country. The Courier had been running a double V campaign since 1942, calling for victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. The campaign had struck a chord with African-American communities across the country, articulating a truth that many had felt, but few had stated so clearly: that fighting for freedom overseas while being denied it at home was a contradiction that needed to be confronted. The photographs from Fort Lawton, accompanied by detailed descriptions of the prisoner escort duties, fit perfectly into that narrative. The editors at the Courier recognized the significance of what Brooks had sent them. These weren't just photographs of injustice in the abstract. They were concrete, specific evidence of a system that valued enemy prisoners over American soldiers. They showed in stark visual terms the gap between American ideals and American reality. The Courier began preparing a feature story, reaching out to Brooks and other soldiers for additional details and context. But the soldiers knew that photographs and newspaper articles, while important, weren't enough. They needed to do something more direct, something that would force the army itself to confront the situation. They needed to work within the system, using the army's own rules and procedures, to create a record that couldn't be dismissed or buried. It was Sergeant McKinney who proposed the idea at a meeting of the unit's senior enlisted men in early May. They had gathered in one of the barracks after duty hours, ostensibly for a routine discussion of operational matters, but really to talk about what they could do, what they should do, about the situation they found themselves in. The meeting had started with frustration, with anger, with expressions of helplessness. But McKinney, drawing on his years of experience navigating systems designed to exclude him, saw a path forward. "We file a formal complaint," McKinney said, his voice calm and authoritative. "Not through our immediate chain of command. They'll just bury it. We go over their heads. We send a detailed report directly to the War Department, documenting every instance of prisoners receiving preferential treatment over American soldiers. We make it official. We make it a matter of record that can't be ignored. We use their own rules, their own procedures, their own documentation requirements to force them to acknowledge what's happening. Private Washington shook his head skeptically. They'll court-martial us for breaking the chain of command. They'll say we're being insubordinate, maybe even accuse us of being disloyal. They'll make an example of us to discourage others from speaking up. Maybe, McKinney acknowledged, his expression serious. But what are they going to do, send us to a more dangerous assignment? We're already loading ammunition ships that could blow up at any moment. We're already doing some of the most dangerous work in the port. And if they court-martial us for stating facts, for documenting what's actually happening, then they'll have to explain why. They'll have to put it on record that we were punished for pointing out that enemy prisoners are treated better than American soldiers. And that's a record they won't want to create, because it's a record that will be embarrassing, that will raise questions they don't want to answer. Mitchell listened, considering. The risk was real. The army didn't like troublemakers, didn't like soldiers who stepped out of line, didn't like questions that challenged established procedures. But McKinney was right about one thing. If they didn't do anything, nothing would change. And at some point, staying silent became its own form of betrayal. Not of the army, but of themselves, of their dignity, of their right to be treated as men and as Americans. "I'll draft it," Mitchell said finally, his voice firm with decision. "I'll document everything, dates, times, locations, witnesses. I'll make it so detailed, so factual, so comprehensive that they can't dismiss it as just complaints or grievances. It'll be a proper military report, following all the correct formats and procedures. The only difference is that instead of going to our commanding officer, it's going to Washington. It's going to people who have the power to change things and who might actually care about the contradiction we're exposing." Over the next week, Mitchell worked on the report every evening. He consulted with the other men, gathered their accounts, verified dates and times. He reviewed Brooks's photographs, using them to corroborate specific incidents. He cross-referenced official duty rosters with the recreational escort assignments, creating a timeline that showed the pattern of discrimination. He kept the language professional, clinical even, avoiding any hint of anger or accusation. He simply stated facts. On this date, at this time, prisoners were admitted to this facility while their American guards were denied entry. He included the names of witnesses, the official orders they had been following, the responses they had received from civilian facility managers. He documented the contrast between the treatment of prisoners and the treatment of American soldiers, letting the facts speak for themselves. The report ran to 14 pages when he finished it. It was comprehensive, detailed, and irrefutable. Every statement in it could be verified. Every claim in it was documented. Every assertion in it was backed by multiple witnesses and, in many cases, by photographic evidence. It was the kind of report that would be difficult to dismiss, difficult to ignore, difficult to bury in the bureaucratic machinery of the military. On May 15, 1944, Mitchell mailed the report to the War Department in Washington, D.C. He sent copies to the NACP, to the Pittsburgh Courier, and to several members of Congress who had shown interest in issues affecting African-American soldiers. He knew he was taking a risk, knew that this could end his military career before it really began, knew that there could be serious consequences for bypassing the chain of command, but he also knew that some things were worth the risk, that some injustices demanded to be confronted, that staying silent was a form of complicity he could no longer accept. The response came faster than he expected. 10 days after mailing the report, Mitchell was summoned to the office of Colonel Harrison Blake, the commanding officer of Fort Lawton. Blake was a career officer, a West Point graduate who had served in the previous global conflict, and who ran his post with rigid attention to regulations and protocol. He was known as a fair but demanding commander, someone who expected his subordinates to follow orders precisely and to maintain discipline at all times. Mitchell had never spoken with Blake directly before. The colonel was far above his rank in the military hierarchy, and being summoned to Blake's office could only mean one thing: trouble. Mitchell stood at attention in front of Blake's desk, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall behind the colonel's head, waiting for the reprimand he was certain was coming. The office was Spartan, decorated only with a few framed certificates and a map of the Pacific Theater. Blake sat behind his desk, the report lying open in front of him, his expression unreadable. Blake sat in silence for a long moment, the report lying open on his desk. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured and controlled. "Corporal Mitchell, I've read your report. Multiple times, in fact." His voice was neutral, giving nothing away. "I've also received communications from the War Department, from congressional offices, and from several newspaper editors, all asking for my response to the allegations contained in this document." Mitchell said nothing. Blake hadn't asked a question, so he didn't speak. That was how military protocol worked. You waited for a direct question before responding. "You put me in a difficult position," Blake continued, his gaze fixed on Mitchell. "You violated the chain of command. You went over the heads of your superiors. By all rights, I should bring you up on charges of insubordination. I should make an example of you to show other soldiers what happens when they don't follow proper procedures." He paused, and Mitchell prepared himself for what was coming, for the formal charges, for the court-martial proceedings, for the potential dishonorable discharge that would follow him for the rest of his life. "But I can't," Blake said. And now there was something in his voice that might have been frustration or respect or perhaps both. "Because everything in this report is accurate. Every date, every time, every location. I had my staff verify all of it. You didn't exaggerate. You didn't make accusations. You just stated facts. You documented what was happening with the precision and thoroughness of a proper military report. And those facts are embarrassing, Corporal. They're embarrassing to this fort, to the army, to the country." Blake stood and walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling military base, at the rows of barracks and warehouses, at the docks where ships were being loaded with supplies bound for the Pacific Theater. "Do you know what's going to happen now, Corporal? The War Department is going to have to respond. They're going to have to explain why enemy prisoners of conflict are being granted access to recreational facilities that American soldiers are denied. They're going to have to explain it to Congress, to the newspapers, to the American public. And they're not going to have a good explanation, because there isn't one. There's no military necessity for it. There's no strategic reason for it. It's just discrimination, pure and simple, and now it's on the record." He turned back to Mitchell. "I want you to understand something. I don't necessarily agree with your methods. I think you should have come through channels, should have trusted the chain of command to address your concerns. But I also think—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I also think that sometimes the only way to fix something broken is to expose it, to make people see what's actually happening, not what they think is happening or what they want to believe is happening. And that's what you've done here. You've held up a mirror and forced people to look at their own reflection." Mitchell risked speaking. "Sir, we just wanted someone to know, someone to acknowledge that this was wrong, that we're American soldiers, and we deserve to be treated with at least as much respect as enemy prisoners." Blake nodded slowly. "Well, now everyone knows. The question is what happens next." What happened next came in stages over the course of the following months, as the machinery of military bureaucracy processed the implications of Mitchell's report. First, on May 29th, the War Department issued a directive to all military installations holding prisoners of conflict. The directive stated that when prisoners were being escorted to off-base facilities for recreational purposes, their military guards must be granted the same access as the prisoners. If a facility would not admit the guards, the prisoners would not be permitted to visit that facility. The directive was carefully worded to avoid explicitly mentioning race, but its intent was clear. The contradiction of enemy prisoners receiving better treatment than American soldiers could no longer be tolerated. The directive sent ripples through the military establishment. Some commanders welcomed it, seeing it as a necessary correction to an obvious injustice. Others resented it, viewing it as unnecessary interference in local arrangements that had been working smoothly. Some civilian facility operators protested, arguing that they were being forced to change policies that reflected community standards and local customs. But the directive stood, backed by the authority of the War Department and the threat of losing lucrative military contracts. Second, several theater owners and restaurant operators in the Seattle area suddenly found themselves removed from the approved list of prisoner recreational facilities. The Liberty Theater was among them. Arthur Shelby, the manager who had turned away Private Washington, gave an interview to a local newspaper, in which he protested that he had simply been following established community standards and that it was unfair to punish him for policies that existed throughout the city. He insisted he bore no personal animosity toward colored soldiers, that he respected their service, but that he had a business to run and policies to maintain. His protests were noted, but ultimately made no difference. The Liberty Theater would not host German prisoners again. Third, the story began to spread beyond military channels and African-American newspapers. The Pittsburgh Courier ran a front-page article titled, "Our Boys Stand Outside While Enemy Sits Inside. Fort Lawton Incident Exposes Contradiction in Fight for Freedom." The article included Brooks's photographs, particularly the image of Washington standing in the rain outside the Liberty Theater, and detailed accounts from multiple soldiers about their experiences escorting prisoners. Other African-American newspapers picked up the story, running their own articles and editorials about the implications of what had happened at Fort Lawton. Then mainstream outlets began reporting on it. Time magazine ran a piece that included one of Brooks's photographs, the one of Washington in the rain, with a caption that read simply, "American Soldier, Enemy Privileges." The article discussed the broader issue of discrimination in the military, using the Fort Lawton incident as a case study in the contradictions facing African-American servicemen. Newsweek followed with its own coverage, interviewing military officials and civil rights leaders about the implications of the War Department directive. The story became part of a larger conversation happening across the country about what America was fighting for and what kind of nation it wanted to be after the conflict ended. If the nation was fighting against tyranny abroad, if it was committed to principles of freedom and equality, how could it maintain systems of discrimination at home? If the enemy was wrong to treat people differently based on their background, how could America do the same? These questions weren't new, but the Fort Lawton incident gave them concrete form, made them impossible to dismiss as abstract philosophical debates. The soldiers of the 531st Port Battalion continued their duties, loading ships, managing cargo, performing the unglamorous but essential work of keeping supply lines running. But they did so, knowing that they had accomplished something significant. They had forced a moment of reckoning, a confrontation with uncomfortable truths that could no longer be ignored. They had shown that resistance was possible, that change could be achieved, that ordinary soldiers could make a difference if they were willing to take the risk. Not everyone appreciated what they had done. Mitchell received anonymous threatening letters, some containing racial slurs and promises of violence, others more subtle but equally menacing. Some fellow soldiers, both white and black, accused him of stirring up trouble, of making things harder for everyone, of damaging the unity that was supposedly essential to military effectiveness. One captain from another unit told him directly that he had damaged morale and created division at a time when unity was essential, when everyone needed to focus on defeating the enemy rather than fighting internal battles. But Mitchell also received other letters, messages of support and gratitude that sustained him during difficult moments. He received a letter from a private in the 92nd Infantry Division, one of the African-American combat units fighting in Italy, thanking him for standing up and giving voice to experiences that many soldiers shared but few had the courage to articulate. He received a letter from a woman in Detroit whose son was serving in the Pacific, telling him that his courage gave her hope that her son might come home to a better country, that the sacrifices being made overseas might actually lead to meaningful change at home. He received a letter from a white officer in the European theater who wrote, "I am ashamed that it took your protest to make me see what was happening right in front of my eyes. I have served alongside colored soldiers, relied on their skill and courage, and yet I failed to notice or question the discrimination they faced. Thank you for opening my eyes and challenging me to be better." These letters mattered to Mitchell, reminding him that the struggle was worthwhile, that the risks he had taken had meaning beyond the immediate consequences, that individual acts of courage could inspire others and create momentum for change. In August of 1944, the 531st Port Battalion was transferred to duties in the Pacific Theater. They would spend the rest of the conflict loading supplies onto ships bound for islands, whose names most Americans had never heard until the fighting started: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Okinawa. They would work 18-hour days in 100-degree heat, moving ammunition that could detonate at any moment, handling supplies that kept American forces advancing across the Pacific toward eventual victory. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and essential. Port battalions like the 531st moved millions of tons of equipment and supplies, keeping the massive military machine functioning across vast ocean distances. They loaded everything from ammunition to food, from medical supplies to vehicle parts, working around the clock to ensure that combat units had what they needed when they needed it. Their work rarely made headlines, rarely earned recognition, but without it, the entire military effort would have ground to a halt. 23 men from the unit would not survive the conflict. Some were lost in shipboard accidents, killed when cargo shifted or equipment failed. Some were caught in attacks on the ports where they worked, when enemy aircraft or submarines managed to penetrate defensive perimeters. Their names are recorded on memorial walls, their service documented in official records, their sacrifice acknowledged in ceremonies and speeches. They died serving a country that didn't always treat them fairly, fighting for ideals that weren't always extended to them, believing in a future that they hoped would be better than the present. But their other contribution, the stand they took at Fort Lawton, the report they filed, the moment of truth they forced, that lives on in a different way, as part of the long history of African Americans fighting for equality within and beyond the military. After the conflict ended, Corporal James Mitchell returned to Georgia. He used the GI Bill to attend college, becoming one of the first members of his family to earn a university degree. He studied education, wanting to shape young minds and help the next generation understand history and their place in it. He became a teacher, spending 32 years educating children in Atlanta public schools. He taught American history, emphasizing the complexity and contradictions of the American story, making sure his students understood that progress was never inevitable, that justice required constant effort and courage. He never spoke much about his military service in casual conversation. When asked about his time in the Army, he would usually deflect, talking instead about the present and the future. But he kept his journal, and he kept the copies of the photographs that Private Brooks had taken, and he kept the letters he had received from people across the country. And when civil rights activists came to interview him, when historians wanted to document what had happened at Fort Lawton, he shared his story with careful precision, making sure the details were accurate, that the significance was understood, that the lessons were clear. In 1963, at the age of 42, Mitchell participated in the March on Washington. He stood in the crowd as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about dreams and freedom, and he thought about standing outside the Liberty Theater 19 years earlier, watching enemy prisoners enter a building he could not. He thought about how far the nation had come since then. Segregation in the military had ended. Jim Crow laws were being challenged. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. But he also thought about how far the nation still had to go, about the resistance that still existed, about the long road still ahead. When Dr. King spoke the words, "I have a dream," Mitchell felt tears on his cheeks, not because he believed the dream was achieved, but because he recognized it. It was the same dream that had sustained him and his fellow soldiers 19 years earlier, the dream that had given them the courage to file that report, to risk their careers, to insist on being treated with dignity. The dream wasn't new, wasn't unique to this moment. It was the old American dream, the one that had always existed in tension with American reality, the one that required generation after generation to fight for its fulfillment. In 1977, a historian researching African-American military service during the Second Global Conflict contacted Mitchell, having come across references to the Fort Lawton incident in War Department archives. The historian was compiling an oral history project, interviewing veterans about their experiences and perspectives. Mitchell agreed to an interview, and for the first time in decades, he spoke publicly and at length about what had happened. "We weren't trying to be heroes," Mitchell said in that interview, his voice still strong at 56 years old, his memory sharp and detailed. "We were just trying to be treated like men, like soldiers, like Americans. We were willing to die for our country. We were doing dangerous work every day, work that kept the entire military effort functioning. but we weren't willing to accept that enemy prisoners deserved more respect than we did. That was a line we couldn't cross in silence. That was a contradiction we couldn't let stand without challenge. The historian asked him if he thought their protest had made a difference, if the risks they took had been worthwhile. Mitchell considered the question carefully, as he always did when asked about those events. The War Department directive didn't end segregation in the military. That wouldn't come until 1948, when President Truman signed the executive order. And even then, it took years for it to really be implemented, for attitudes to change, for the military to truly become integrated. And military desegregation didn't end Jim Crow in civilian life. That took the civil rights movement, took decades of struggle and sacrifice, took countless acts of courage by people who risked everything for justice. He paused, looking at the photographs spread out on the table between them. Images of young men who had stood in the rain outside a theater, who had maintained their dignity in the face of indignity. But did we make a difference? Yes, because we made it harder for people to pretend they didn't see what was happening. We forced them to acknowledge the contradiction. We created a record that couldn't be erased or forgotten. And once you acknowledge a contradiction, once you admit that something is wrong, it becomes harder to keep doing it. It might not stop immediately, but you've planted a seed. You've created a crack in the wall. And eventually, enough cracks and the whole wall comes down. Private First Class Robert Washington, who had stood at that theater entrance and been turned away, who had expressed in quiet words the absurdity of the situation, went on to become a civil rights attorney after the conflict. He attended law school on the GI Bill, driven by a desire to use legal tools to fight discrimination. He argued voting rights cases in Alabama, fighting the same kind of discrimination that had kept his father from the polls, that had denied African Americans political power despite their citizenship. He won some cases and lost others. But he kept fighting, believing that every legal victory, no matter how small, helped build momentum for larger change. In a 1968 interview, Washington reflected on his military service and its connection to his later work. "People sometimes ask me if I'm bitter about how we were treated during the conflict," Washington said, his voice thoughtful and measured. "And I tell them no, I'm not bitter. I'm angry, yes. What happened was wrong, and anger at injustice is appropriate, is necessary even. But bitterness implies that I feel defeated, that I think it was all for nothing. And I don't believe that. We didn't win every battle. Hell, we didn't win most battles. But we won some, and each victory, no matter how small, made the next one more possible. The Fort Lawton incident taught me that speaking truth to power, documenting injustice, using official channels to expose contradiction, these tools work. They don't work instantly, they don't solve everything, but they work." Sergeant Harold McKinney, whose grandfather had been enslaved, and who had urged his fellow soldiers to make their oppressors uncomfortable with their own contradictions, became a union organizer after the conflict. He spent 40 years fighting for workers' rights, always with the same philosophy: document everything, state the facts, force people to confront the reality of what they're doing. He helped organize dock workers, factory employees, service industry workers, always focusing on building coalitions, on creating records that couldn't be denied, on using the system's own rules to expose its failures. He passed away in 1986, at the age of 78, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had grown up hearing stories of their grandfather's service, both in uniform and out of it. At his funeral, his eldest daughter spoke about the lessons he had taught her, about the importance of standing up for what's right even when it's difficult, about the power of documentation and truth-telling, about the long struggle for justice that requires persistence across generations. The Liberty Theatre closed in 1972, a victim of changing entertainment habits and suburban flight. The Grand Movie Palace that had once been Seattle's finest theatre fell into disrepair, its Art Deco fixtures gathering dust, its ornate lobby hosting fewer and fewer patrons until finally the doors closed for good. The building was eventually demolished in 1978 and replaced with a parking structure, but before it was torn down, a local historical society placed a plaque on the building, commemorating the events of April 1944. The plaque read, "On this site, American soldiers were denied entry to a theater that welcomed enemy prisoners of conflict. Their protest helped expose the contradictions of fighting for freedom abroad while denying it at home, and contributed to the eventual integration of the United States military. Their courage in standing up for dignity and equality serves as a reminder that justice requires constant vigilance and that the American promise of freedom must be defended in every generation. The story of Fort Lawton and the 531st Port Battalion became part of a larger historical narrative about the African-American experience during the Second Global Conflict. It joined other stories of the Tuskegee Airmen who had to fight for the right to fly combat missions, of the Red Ball Express drivers who kept supplies moving through Europe while facing discrimination at every turn, of the countless African-American soldiers who served their country with honor while their country denied them basic dignity and respect. These stories mattered because they complicated the simple narrative of American heroism during the conflict. They forced acknowledgement that victory over fascism abroad did not automatically translate into freedom at home. They showed that the fight for equality was ongoing, that it required constant vigilance and courage, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with words, with documentation, with the simple insistence on truth and justice. In 2007, the United States Army formally recognized the service of the 531st Port Battalion with a unit citation. The citation noted their exceptional service in support of operations in the Pacific Theater and their contribution to advancing equality within the armed forces through their courageous stand against discrimination. It was a small acknowledgement, coming more than 60 years after the fact, but it mattered to the few surviving members of the unit and to their families. It was official recognition that what they had done mattered, that their protest had significance, that their courage had contributed to progress. At the ceremony, one of those surviving members, Private Eugene Carter, who had once stood outside the Liberty Theater, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands, spoke to the gathered crowd. He was 85 years old, his hair white, his back bent by age, but his mind was sharp and his voice was clear. "We did our duty," Carter said, his words carrying across the assembled crowd of veterans, family members, historians, and military officials. That's what soldiers do. We followed orders. We performed our assigned tasks. We served our country to the best of our abilities, but we also did something else. We stood up. We said that how we were being treated was wrong, and we made people hear us. We didn't do it with violence. We didn't do it by refusing orders or abandoning our posts. We did it by using the tools we had: words, documentation, the truth. We worked within the system, using its own rules and procedures to expose its failures. And eventually the truth was heard. He looked out at the audience, at the young soldiers in the crowd wearing the modern uniform, at the historians taking notes, at the journalists recording his words, at the family members holding photographs of fathers and grandfathers who had served in the 531st. I want young people today to understand something important. Change doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't come from grand gestures or single moments of heroism. It happens in small steps, in individual stands, in people deciding that they won't accept injustice, even when accepting it would be easier and safer. We weren't the first to make that stand, and we weren't the last. But we were part of a long chain of people who said no, who insisted on being treated with dignity, who refused to accept that things had to stay the way they were, just because that's how they'd always been. He paused, emotional now in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in decades, his voice breaking slightly. Some of my brothers from the battalion didn't make it home. They died serving a country that didn't always treat them fairly, fighting for ideals that weren't always extended to them. But they died knowing they had stood for something important. They died knowing they had made a difference, however small. And that matters. That will always matter. Their sacrifice wasn't just about defeating the enemy overseas. It was about making America better, about pushing the country toward its ideals, about insisting that freedom and equality weren't just words but principles that had to apply to everyone. The Fort Lawton incident, as it came to be known in historical literature, represents a particular kind of resistance, one that worked within the system while simultaneously exposing the system's flaws. The soldiers didn't desert. They didn't refuse orders. They didn't resort to violence or sabotage. Instead, they used official channels, military protocols, and documentary evidence to make an undeniable case that what was happening was wrong. This approach had its critics then, and continues to generate debate among historians and activists today. Some argued at the time that it wasn't radical enough, that it conceded too much to the existing power structure, that it sought reform rather than revolution. Others argued that it asked too much of people who were already bearing the burden of discrimination, that they shouldn't have had to prove their worth or document their oppression in order to be treated with basic human dignity. But the soldiers themselves were pragmatists. They understood that they were working within constraints, operating in a context where their options were limited, and the consequences of missteps could be severe. They knew that overt rebellion would be crushed, that they would be court-martialed or worse, that their protest would be dismissed as the actions of malcontents or troublemakers. So they chose a different path, one that required patience, precision, and an unwavering commitment to truth and documentation. The impact of their protest rippled outward in ways both large and small. The War Department directive that resulted from their report affected prisoner escort policies at military installations across the country. It didn't end segregation in the military. That would require the Presidential Executive Order of 1948 and years of subsequent implementation, but it established an important principle: that American soldiers deserved at least the same treatment as the enemy prisoners they guarded. More broadly, the Fort Lawton incident became part of the growing awareness among white Americans of the contradictions inherent in fighting a conflict against racial supremacy while maintaining racial hierarchies at home. It wasn't the only factor in that growing awareness. There were countless other protests, countless other documented injustices, countless other moments when African American soldiers and civilians insisted on being heard. But it was part of that larger movement, one more voice in a chorus that was becoming impossible to ignore. The soldiers who participated in the protest went on to live full lives. They raised families, built careers, contributed to their communities in countless ways. Some became activists in the civil rights movement, applying lessons learned in the military to the broader struggle for equality. Others focused on their work, their families, their private lives, choosing to make their contributions in quieter ways, but all of them carried with them the knowledge that they had stood up at a crucial moment, that they had refused to accept injustice silently, that they had made a difference in the long struggle for equality and dignity. Their children and grandchildren grew up hearing the stories. They learned about the grandfather who had taken photographs that ended up in national magazines, whose images had helped document an important moment in history. They learned about the great-uncle who had drafted the report that went to Washington, whose words had forced the military to confront its own contradictions. They learned about the father who had stood in the rain outside a theater, maintaining his dignity even as he was denied the most basic respect, refusing to let discrimination break his spirit or compromise his sense of self-worth. And those descendants carried those stories forward, understanding that the fight their ancestors had waged was not just a historical artifact, but a living legacy. The tools might change: social media instead of newspaper articles, viral videos instead of photographs, online petitions instead of formal reports, but the essential truth remained that injustice must be named, documented, and challenged, and that ordinary people have the power to do that challenging if they're willing to take the risk and accept the consequences. In the end, the story of the 531st Port Battalion and the Fort Lawton incident is about more than one protest or one directive. It's about the long, difficult, ongoing struggle to make America live up to its ideals. It's about the courage required to stand up when standing up might cost you everything. It's about the power of truth, properly documented and properly presented, to change minds and change policies, even when that change comes slowly and incompletely. It's about soldiers who were asked to guard men who had fought against their country, who were then told that those enemy soldiers deserved better treatment than they did, and who responded not with violence or bitterness, but with a carefully constructed, meticulously documented case for justice. They understood that anger without strategy accomplishes nothing, that righteous indignation without documentation can be dismissed, that protest without evidence can be ignored. They won, not completely, not immediately, not perfectly, but they won. The directive was changed, the story was told, the truth was acknowledged, the record was created. And while that didn't end discrimination, didn't solve all problems, didn't create a perfect world, it mattered. It moved the needle, it made the next fight a little bit easier, the next victory a little bit more possible, the next generation's struggle a little bit less lonely. And that, in the end, is what courage looks like. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but ordinary people doing what they can with what they have, refusing to accept that wrong is right just because wrong is easier, or more comfortable or more socially acceptable. It's people who understand that change is a long process, that justice is achieved through persistent effort across generations, and that every small victory contributes to larger transformations. The men of the 531st Port Battalion understood this. They lived it. They demonstrated it through their actions. And their example remains decades later, a reminder that change is possible, that justice can be achieved, that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they act with courage and conviction, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply the truth, spoken clearly, documented thoroughly, and presented without compromise. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.